Got it.
Patience.
Okay. So I think we have it figured it out. I think we are live. We should be live. I want to welcome everybody to our Yom Kippur interim program. You know, what is high holidays without something happening? And this year's no different, even though everything is online. So I do believe we are streaming online right now. I want to thank everybody for joining our interim program. This has been a wonderful tradition that I've inherited, where we invite congregants to come and speak about how Judaism has impacted their lives. Something else that I inherited, which I'm deeply grateful for, is Marvin Zexter as a MC of this program. For the last several years, he has been kind of coordinating it and introducing people, and I can't say how grateful I am that he is doing it again this year. I know that we're starting 5 minutes late because we had an issue with Zoom and live stream. I'm going to pass off the baton to Marvin, one of our past presidents, who is leading us in our conversation, and he'll introduce our speakers and get us going. So bevakasha, thank you, Marvin.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. Shana Tova to everyone. And I guess it wouldn't be Zoom Yom Kippur without a couple of technological glitches, would it? So welcome everyone to our Zoom version of the interim program we've done for many years here at Anshe Emeth. It is an honor and a privilege for me to be able to host this once again. Today we have two speakers, Frankie Bush and Sarah Kahn. The format we're going to employ is similar to what we've done in the past. I'm going to ask each of them to give us their presentation. At the end of their presentation, we'll open it up for questions. Now, as we're on Zoom, obviously it wouldn't be possible for you to ask questions. The rabbi and I certainly will be able to do that because we'll be on the platform as well with them. However, Rabbi Baisley's email address is in the lower corner of Rabbi's name up there. So you can.
I'm putting it up right now so people can see it as rabbi.baisley@aemt.info. So you keep talking, I'll let my screen stay up so people can see it.
There you go. So as I started to say, you can see Rabbi's email address there. If you have questions that you would like us to present for you to either Frankie Bush or Sarah Kahn, please feel free to email them to Rabbi Baisley. So without further ado, let me introduce Frankie Bush. Frankie and Mark Bush have been members of Anshe Emeth for 44 years. Their daughters, Caroline Bush Packman and Joanna Bush Skier, still consider Rabbi Miller their rabbi. Over the years, Frankie has served on the Board of Trustees, the Art Committee, and put together the Adult Education Program and its brochures. She was a co-creator with Barbara Sigmund of the mosaic that now hangs in the Barbara Kogan Littman Social Hall. Frankie has mounted 2 art shows at the temple. She and Mark hosted some of the Kippur speakers who came to New Brunswick from around the world. She is a member of the Women's Spirituality in the Encore of Anshe Emeth, where she helps publish the Encore newsletter. Without further ado, let me turn it over, Frankie Bush.
Shana Tova to everybody. 3 years ago, Rabbi Miller approached me to say, I have a project for you. Would I be interested in compiling 32 years of the 128 interim talks that he had in his file cabinet? These talks began in 1986 when Rabbi Miller invited 4 members of the congregation to speak about how Judaism has influenced my life at a Yom Kippur interim service. The first 4 speakers were Ruth Pat, Paul Smilo, Ann Thayer Cohen, and Larry Zicklin. I said yes to the project, as had the 128 people he had asked to speak. And a team of 10 of us, headed by Mark Bush, editor-in-chief and major technical support, were able to put together and print 600 books. Our publisher was Staples with a 30% off coupon. Rabbi Miller gave these books to all of the congregation as a gift on the occasion of his retirement, in honor of the 44 years of sharing life's journey together. Rabbi Baisley has continued the tradition of the Yom Kippur interim speaker program and I am speaker number 5 in edition 2 of the book. My story begins in Wolverhampton, England, where I was born a few months after the end of World War II. My parents, John and Marion Lieberman, had been assimilated secular Jews in Vienna. My father was a graduate of law school and my mother of design school. They were opera and skiing aficionados. In 1939, their lives were turned upside down and they both escaped Nazi-occupied Vienna as refugees to England, tragically leaving all of my grandparents who were murdered in Theresienstadt, Auschwitz, and the woods in Riga. In England, my parents married, started new lives in a new language, rarely to speak German again, and were those survivors who did not talk about the Holocaust, but lived in the present and in the future. My family emigrated to the United States in 1949, traveling on the Queen Mary to New York Harbor and our new life in Columbus, Ohio, where my father was hired as an electrical engineer, a degree he acquired in England. We lived in a suburb of Columbus, not in Bexley, the Jewish section of town, and my sister and I went to Sunday school, not Hebrew school, at Temple Israel Reform Temple on the other side of town. The Union Prayer Book was mostly in English, and the only Hebrew letter that I learned was the Shin, which was the shape of the door handle of the synagogue. Like my parents, I lived an assimilated secular Jewish life with friends of all religions and education as the most important part of my life plan. I followed my sister to Simmons College in Boston, where we both majored in Spanish education, and we both married men we met in the neighboring colleges. I met Mark on Beacon Street while he was at Boston University Law School. I was walking with my roommate to buy Metrocal, and Mark was with his roommate coming from Brigham's Ice Cream. We became engaged to be married within 3 months of meeting. Our wedding was at Temple Israel in Columbus. The rabbi asked Mark if he wanted him, the rabbi, to wear a yarmulke during the ceremony. Mark said yes. Mark's family brought a different kind of Judaism. Moses and Lena Bush arrived in New Brunswick in 1904 from Pinsk. They were observant Jews and belonged to Avos Achim. They spoke Yiddish and baked mandelbread and joyfully celebrated all the holidays. Mark, grandson of Moshe of John Street in New Brunswick, is a knowledgeable traditional Jew. He is a Hebrew, Talmud, and Torah scholar, an ardent Zionist, and student of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. I have had homeschooling in those subjects for over 53 years, and I am eternally grateful to Mark for bringing me toward Judaism in a way I never imagined possible or available. Our daughters, Caroline and Joanna, each became bat mitzvah at AEMT and graduated from the Temple High School. Both were married by Rabbi Miller, and each married men whose fathers were presidents of their Reform congregations. We have been blessed to be at the B'nai Mitzvot of 3 of our 4 grandchildren. Grandchild number 4 is scheduled for 9/11/21, which is actually this year in the Jewish calendar. Every year since 1923, the New Brunswick Bush family has held a Kiddush after Rosh Hashanah services, first at Aunt Jenny's house on Seaman Street, later in North Brunswick at Aunt Jenny's niece's house, and then in Monroe at Tamara Bush's mother's Dolly's house. And this year, for the first time at the 97th Bush family Rosh Hashanah Kiddush in New Brunswick, we had the first ever virtual Kiddush with 45 family members on screen. Mark says we have a mixed marriage, Litvak and Galicianer. I am pleased we have a mixed marriage of Orthodox and Reform. Aunt Sheemeth has been a huge influence on my Judaism through Jewish education, Jewish ritual, and connection to the Jewish community. I learn from every sermon and every time I open the prayer book. I am forever fascinated by the timeliness of the Torah, the wisdom of the Talmud, the brilliance of the Hebrew language, and the psychology of life cycle events. If there is a silver lining to the pandemic, it is bringing the temple into our home. Zoom Torah classes, services, cooking classes, book and film discussions, town meetings, and even Tat Shabbat, sometimes all in 1 week. Israel is a large part of my Jewish consciousness. Mark and I have visited Israel and my 25 Israeli cousins over 10 times. Landing in Lod is a feeling of coming home. My daily newspaper reading includes the Times of Israel and the Jerusalem Post, plus many websites with content relating to Israel and world Jewry. And I feel fortunate and privileged to count among my rabbis, Rabbi Baisley, Rabbi Glasser, and Rabbi Miller. This week, I attended Rabbi Miller's Rosh Hashanah lecture on the meaning of who shall live and who shall die. At the end of the lecture, Rabbi Miller said, I have a project for you. Would you be interested in compiling some of our congregants' interpretations of the Yom Kippur prayer? And this is where all of you come in. Rabbi Miller believes that we don't often give all the members enough opportunities to seriously think, reflect, and write about some of the great themes of Judaism. We rely too much on our rabbis, which the rabbis appreciate, but that limits everyone's personal reflections. So stand by to be a contributor to the next publication of Angie Emeth. Thank you.
Frankie, thank you very, very much. As I said initially, I'm going to ask Sarah Kahn to speak. And then after Sarah speaks, we'll be able to open it up for questions. So Sarah Kahn. Sarah Kahn joined the Anshe Emeth community in 2004 and became an adult B'nai Mitzvah in 2005. She proudly serves on the Board of Trustees since June of 2019, volunteers at many mini mitzvah corps, serves on the nominating committee, Va'ad Torah, and served on the Sacred Spaces and Purim Extravaganza committees. She serves on the advisory board of Elijah's Promise Soup Kitchen and Culinary Training Institute, and is a co-leader of Co-op Girl Scout Troop 80337. Sarah is a director of state public policy for Novartis, where she works to shape government policies which promote innovation and patient access to innovative therapies and cost-saving generics and biosimilars. Sarah and her husband, Robert Asaro Angelo, and children Joseph, who's 15, a Madrich, a VP of Social Action of 80 in Jude Directions and in the high school program, and Leah, 11, who is in the religious school, middle school youth leadership council, and the junior choir. They all live in East Brunswick. Without further ado, Sarah Kahn.
Thank you, Marvin. And thank you so much, Rabbi Baisley, for inviting me to speak today. I said yes immediately, but I questioned my decision for weeks afterwards, knowing that this would be a difficult and emotional task. Thank you to my husband, Robert, for your constant support and your superior editing skills. My gratitude towards my parents is immeasurable, and I hope repeating our family history ensures it will live on for generations to come. My family history, as with so many Jewish people, is one of movement, turbulence, and despair. Understanding our past and building a loving, more hopeful future for our children, L'dor V'dor, is always our goal. My paternal grandparents, Leon Kahn and Zosia Rosenzweig, who we knew as Jaja and Babcia, grandfather and grandmother in Polish, left Poland in 1936 because Jaja, a communist, had an interest in working with the Popular Front, an alliance of left-wing movements, including the French Communist Party. He entered France illegally, and Babcia, a chemistry student at Warsaw University, waited for travel papers and joined him in Paris, and she eventually entered the Sorbonne. My father, Andrew Kahn, was born in Paris in 1939. Before the Nazi occupation of Paris, the owner of their apartment, Madame Robb, had a son who became very sick. Her doctor could not help him, but my grandparents arranged and paid for a Jewish physician, Dr. Solomon, who escaped Nazi persecution from Germany just before He saved her son, and Madame Rob was very grateful. In June 1942, Jews in Paris were ordered to wear a yellow Star of David badge for easy identification. And soon, the Nazis, aided by the French police, began deporting foreign and stateless Jews to the extermination camps. The next month, the French police came to arrest my grandparents and father. Luckily, they were out when the police arrived, and Madame Rob, grateful for their generosity and friendship, told the police that they all left Paris. The police did not believe her, and they waited for the family to arrive. So Madame Rob hid them, with my father, only 3 at the time, and my grandparents in her storage room. They lived without basic necessities, and it was clear they needed a more secure and long-term place to hide. Babcia Zsuzsa learned that her brother Marian, part of the Warsaw Uprising, was arrested and killed in Auschwitz. Her father and stepmother were likely killed in late 1942 in the Warsaw Ghetto or at an extermination camp. Madame Rob arranged a new hiding place with a friend who owned an inn outside of Paris. So they stowed away in an overnight truck, which saved them from extermination. They stayed at the inn, but life was very difficult, and food and medication were a burden to receive. In February 1944, they were forced to leave because of continual danger of being discovered by the Gestapo. With the help of the innkeeper, my grandparents found a family who agreed to hide my father, while they went back to hide and find illegal work in Paris, living separately to avoid detention. The family they found had a daughter around my father's age, and they cared for him as if he were their own child. He became one of thousands of hidden children of the Holocaust. My father is still active today in an organization called Children of the Holocaust Survivors. At the end of 1944, the Germans fled, the advancing forces, Allied forces, and my grandparents were liberated and the family was reunited in Paris. They attended the Victory Europe Day Parade in March 4th, 1945, with my father sitting on his father's shoulder and watching Charles de Gaulle, the general, march by. They left Paris for Warsaw in September 1945 to find my Babcia Zsuzsa's parents, but discovered a city in ruin and learned from survivors that her parents never returned from forced labor camps outside of the Warsaw Ghetto. It was assumed they were sent to the extermination camp in Treblinka. The Kahn family settled into life in Warsaw. They were secular Jews, only celebrating major holidays. They never denied their Jewish heritage, but they did not attend synagogue or provide my father with a formal Jewish education. My mother's side of the family also struggled to survive through the war and its aftermath. My maternal grandfather, Benjamin Shapiro, was the son of an Orthodox rabbi in Treblinka. Jaja Benjamin considered becoming a rabbi himself. He studied at yeshiva, but as a teenager, he connected with a communist youth organization and abandoned Jewish studies for other ideals. By 19, he was convicted of illegal communist activity and served 9 years in prison. Pola Fleur, my maternal grandmother, Babcia Pola, was born in Buda, but grew up in Lwów, now in Poland. She was the youngest of 6 children, and she grew up in a religious home. They were very poor, and after her father lost 2 fingers in a factory accident, Babcia left school in 7th grade and worked to support the family. Jaja Benjamin went to Lwów when he left prison, and he met Pola, who was drawn from her poverty to the communist and socialist movement for its promise of equality. Before the war, Jaja Benjamin became a high-ranking member of the communist movement in charge of moving money for the party. Before the Germans occupied Lwów in 1941, he was sent with the money he managed to Russia, and Babcia Pola joined him. Instead of going to the army, the Russians sent him and Babcia to a work camp in the Ural Mountains because he was a Pole. The conditions were very harsh, and Jaja Benjamin worked 16-hour days building trains while Babcia cleaned the train cars. Every resource was needed to support the war, so they were starving with 1 piece of bread a day and little else. And despite these devastating conditions, my mother, Helena, was born in Magnatorsk, which means Iron City, in July 1945. Babcia Pola's parents, her 5 brothers, their wives, all their children, they were all killed. Our family believes in Baba Yar, but there are no records of it. Excuse me. After the war, my grandparents decided to leave Russia and return to Poland with my mother, who was 7 months at the time, and they settled in Szczecin, which is a town in northern Poland. 4 years later, my uncle Majek was born. Their family observed holidays based on tradition established by their parents. They frequently attended performance in the Jewish Cultural Center, where Babcia was an amateur actress. The religious community was very small, and as ties to Judaism were cultivated only by lay associations, regarding Yiddish culture, but it was also gradually beginning to disappear as the years went on. In 1967, there were about 30,000 Jews living in Poland, a country of 32 million. The older generation consisted of Jews who survived the Holocaust. Their children, born after the war, quickly assimilated into Polish society. At the outbreak of the Six-Day War, the Communist Party, in charge of the Polish government, accused Israel of forming a coalition with American British imperialists and decided Jews were traitors. An open purge unfolded within the ruling party. Military officers, militia, and teachers, they were required to take courses informing them that Jews were enemies and traitors. Many people were not even aware of their Jewish roots, so accusing them of disloyalty to Poland was a complete shock. After the anti-Semitic events of 1968, Jaja Benjamin lost his job as the supervisor of a factory, and the family decided to emigrate to the US, where his older sister and brother lived. My mother was a student, but had to leave university. In 1969, the Shapiros left their home in Szczecin to go to Vienna. Jaja Lewon was the director of the Department of Agriculture Ministry, which is similar to the US Department of Agriculture. In 1968, he was forced to take an early retirement because he was a Jew. And after that, my father tried to convince his parents to emigrate, but his mother, who was plagued with chronic illness, was not well enough to leave. My father was now an electrical engineer. He lost his job in the summer of 1969 in a reorganization of his department. In order to emigrate from Poland, Jews had to sign a document to renounce their Polish citizenship and declare their leave for Israel. In exchange, they received a document podrezi, which was a travel document, instead of a passport for those wishing to emigrate. It stated, the bearer of this document is not a citizen of the Polish People's Republic. In my father's case, in order to get the travel document, he had to renounce his Polish citizenship, return his Army officer ID, and return his apartment back to the co-op and pay an equivalent of 2 months' salary. He was given only 20 days to leave Poland. The Jewish refugee organization, HIAS, sent the Shapiros and my father on separate journeys from Vienna to Rome, a transition point where Jewish refugees who did not want to immigrate to Israel were processed. HIAS gave them temporary housing, a monthly stipend to cover their cost of living, and help with applications for visas to the US consulate. My parents met at a party in Rome and dated for only a few months before my father received a parolee entrance visa as a political refugee and went to New York in March 1970. They wrote letters and my father proposed marriage. My mother accepted, and the Shapiros arrived in New York in June. They married July 31st, 1970. When I was 3, we moved to the Brunswick Acres section of South Brunswick. It was a true dream for my parents. Their daughters, my older sister Margie and I, would grow up in a quiet neighborhood, walk to a great school, and we had room for my grandparents to visit. We grew up always knowing we were Jewish. Our family was from Poland, and we celebrated major holidays. We lit Hanukkah, we ate apples and honey on Rosh Hashanah. We read the Passover story from the free Maxwell House Haggadahs my mother collected from ShopRite, and we even occasionally attended Purim carnivals, usually dressed as Esther. We spent a great deal of time at our Babcha and Jaja's in Brooklyn, in their apartment, which was near the boardwalk in Brighton Beach. And Jaja listened to hours of Yiddish radio, and he and Babcha told us stories of Poland and Russia as we got older, about their family who perished and how they struggled and survived. Their lives seemed to bridge the past and the present, and we marveled how markedly different our lives were and how we were free to learn and experience things they can only imagine. My parents wanted us to receive the formal Jewish education. They did not, so they visited a local synagogue. The synagogue showed them a Jew sheet and told my parents if they could afford a house in Brunswick Acres, they too could afford the dues. This ended any effort to join the synagogue. Margie and I were amongst a small minority of Jewish kids in our neighborhood who did not attend Hebrew school. When the regional Chabad offered a Hebrew school program at our elementary school, my parents signed us up. Margie was a diligent student. She picked up Hebrew quickly and excelled. 2 years her junior, with a spotty history of commitments, 1 year of ballet, tumbling, karate, piano, I decided Hebrew school is not for me. My teacher was a commanding Israeli woman whom as I remember it, only spoke Hebrew. So at the ripe age of 9, I was a Hebrew school dropout. The next year, my parents saved up and we took a remarkable 2-week trip to Israel where Margie became a bat mitzvah on the top of Masada. She was just incredible as she read Torah, her Torah portion, and led the service. We also visited the Kotel, where I still remember the strange feeling of entering the space with hordes of people and separating my father because men and women could not enter and pray together. I remember visiting Yad Vashem and the room of the eternal flame and learning about the concept of righteous Gentiles, including the family who cared for my father during the war. This trip was when I was first introduced to the concept of Israel as our homeland, and perhaps if Israel was formed, a formed nation, the Jewish state, the atrocities of the Holocaust may never have occurred to their full extent. We also spent summers vacationing in the Catskills at the Jewish retreat Sylvan Lake with a growing group of immigrants from Poland that included my grandparents' generation as well. My parents helped organize an international reunion in 1990 in the Catskills, where a few hundred people gathered and shared memories and forged friendships for their children. In 1993, we attended the second reunion in '68, the year the forced immigration from Poland began in Nahariya, Israel, with almost 1,000 people from around the world, people who settled in Israel, US, Canada, throughout Europe, Australia, and South Africa. They all gathered with their families for the next generation of Jews. I attended Rutgers as an undergrad and made some Jewish friends. They took me to the Hillel for Shabbat services, but with so little knowledge of the prayers in Hebrew, I felt like I did not fit in. I relished Jewish learning in different ways. I took several Holocaust classes, a class in Jewish art, as well as Jewish memory, where my father came to speak, sharing his story as a hidden child in France. In 1998, we went to Israel for the third time for Reunion 68 in Ashkelon, and we rejoiced again with our friends from around the world. At the final night dinner, the Polish ambassador to Israel spoke, stating that the communist government in Poland was no reflection of the Poland today, which is ironic because of all the present day anti-Semitism in Poland, and that all whose citizenship were rescinded were welcome to apply for dual citizenship. Because Poland was part of the EU, some people did take advantage of this offer. It gave Israelis protection against their status as citizens of the Jewish state. My parents were not amongst them. I met my husband, Robert, in graduate school at Rutgers. After dating for 4 years, we were engaged and planning our wedding. We celebrated holidays with both sets of our families, secular Christmas Eve and Christmas with his family, and the Jewish holidays with my family. We were married under a huppah, signed a ketubah, and settled into life in Highland Park. I decided it was time to continue my Jewish education because how could I ask my future children to study when I never made the commitment to my faith that I would want of them? I can't remember exactly how I learned that Anshe Amos offered adult B'nai Mitzvah classes, but I enrolled, and under the direction of Rabbi Gold and the support of Rabbi Miller and Cantor Ad, I spent 2 nights a week at Anshe Amos in Hebrew and religious classes for about a year and occasionally attending services. In June 2005, when I was 6 months pregnant with Joseph, I became a bat mitzvah, reading from the Torah. My family bought me a tali with beautiful gold embroidery and the names of the 4 matriarchs. It was one of the proudest days of my life. Joseph was born 3 months later. He had a bris in our small living room and my father holding him, beaming with pride. He was named Joseph after Robert's maternal grandfather and Benjamin in Hebrew for my maternal grandfather. He was enrolled at the Gan, where we made lasting friendships. And Joseph learned about Jewish traditions, songs, foods, holidays, and came home with countless art projects, puppets for Passover, paper menorahs, Seder plates, and more. Just before Joseph was 2, we traveled to Poland with my parents for a small reunion of Szczecin friends and to see where my parents grew up. We visited their apartments, the only remaining synagogue in Warsaw, the future home of the Museum of the Warsaw Ghetto, which is still not complete, and the Jewish cemetery outside of Warsaw where Babcia, Zosia, and Jaja Lewin are buried. From Krakow, Rob and I took a day trip to Auschwitz. We rode a bus with an international group and prepared ourselves for an uncertain experience. This was the first time either of us visited a camp, and we felt an immense weight. We walked through the infamous gates, crowded into sleeping barracks, viewed the remaining crematories, and walked through acres of green fields that were once work and killing fields. This was a place where millions of Jews, Christians, LGBTQ, political activists, musicians, poets, writers, grandparents, parents, and children perished, including so many in my family. We left with little to say, but we were stunned and humbled by the experience and pledged to return with our children one day. Our daughter Leah was born in 2011 and was enrolled in the Gan. Leah was named on the bima in the sanctuary of Anshe Amos with Rabbi Miller. We named her Leah Ruth, reflecting many parts of our family heritage. My maternal grandmother, Sarah Leah, for Leah, my paternal grandfather, and Ruth for Rob's paternal grandmother. Both kids were enrolled in the religious school, And we are always beaming in pride as our kids have so much knowledge about prayers, traditions, and stories from the Torah, and how so many of those stories apply to our world today. We love hearing them sing Manishna Halayla Hazeh on Passover. And they used to act out the story using puppets of tongue depressors and paper that they created at the religious school. In 2018, we took a family trip to Israel for our niece Sophia and Joseph's upcoming mitzvahs, and to learn about the origins of religion, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. We visited a hotel ever cognizant of the divide amongst men and women and the fight for equality. The trip occurred over Passover, and we held our Seder in a Jewish cultural center in Jerusalem, and were furnished with the same Maxwell House Haggadahs from my childhood. On our trip, we learned about the complex histories, the many wars, and how significant the Holocaust and the diaspora were to the history of the Jewish state, and why a Jewish state is critical. I know that many struggle with or even reject this idea, and confounded by the contradictory nature of politics of a nation that should recognize me as a Jew, born of 2 Jewish parents, yet I would have to convert if I ever wanted to be a citizen. And the same country would not recognize my husband or my marriage, and yet I still believe Israel is critical and it's a necessary place in the world. And I hope that the work of the URJ and so many other progressive organizations can continue to shed light on the need to include diverse voices, views, and religions into the government. When looking into our home, you can see a place full of Jewish symbols and objects, mezuzahs in our doorways, menorahs from trips to Poland and Israel, Shabbat candles, which we often like because Rob reminds us, a tzedakah box replica of the Dome of Anshe Emet, and some homemade tzedakah boxes too. Joseph proudly displays his bar mitzvah certificate on his wall and his shofar in his room, which he has had the privilege to blow at several High Holy Day services, including last week at our family tashlik at Barrington Lake. For nearly 16 years, we have had the privilege to worship, learn, and grow with the supportive community at Anshe Emet, learning not just about the ancient words and traditions, but how we are commanded to feed the hungry, comfort the widow, welcome the stranger, and call out and correct injustice wherever it may lay. Our family is deeply involved in Elijah's Promise and is so proud to support the work of the CDC and the URJ and all the social action efforts to create a more peaceful, pluralistic, and equitable US and Israel. After a long week, we treasure the soul-lifting feeling that comes from singing and praying and coming together with our community. We love singing along with the choir and the cantor and the congregation. I've always felt this immense connection at services, thinking about Jews around the world, and that they say the same sacred words from our shared Torah and texts. When speaking with my mother recently, she said, Judaism is not just a religion, it's a nation. We are standing on the shoulders of thousands of years of tradition. I feel privileged to be part of this nation and an immense responsibility to keep our traditions alive and make our world peaceful, kind, and a more equitable place for thousands of years to come. Lador Bador, Shana Tova.
Shana Tova, Sarah. Thank you very, very much. And Frankie, thank you as well. I'm curious how both of you feel about having done this kind of a presentation. And I ask that because I did the same thing myself a few years ago. And as I listened to both of you, I heard some of my own story. Sarah, you got emotional at times, and I appreciate that because when I did my presentation several years ago, people found out something about me that a lot of people didn't know. I'm first generation. My parents met in a displaced persons camp after the war in Farnwald, Germany in 1947. They came, in 1945. They came to this country in 1947 for the first time. People meet you and they think that you've been here forever, or they know something about you, and then they find out something in your story they had no idea. Frankie, I had no idea of your ancestry and your family's history. I knew not, I'm reading what you, because you were kind enough to give me a copy of it, but I'm listening to what you're saying about your parents, the move to England, how they never spoke of the Holocaust. They were, I think as you said it, they were those survivors that didn't discuss it. I think that's the way you phrased it. My parents were the opposite. They were the ones who did. So I wondered, how do both of you feel, having done this presentation, has it given you any more insight? Has it changed your perspective on anything? How do you feel about it?
Go ahead, Sarah.
I mean, I think it caused me to ask a lot of questions. And I have to say, I'm embarrassed to say that I probably cut 2,000 words. So that would have been another 20 minutes. I am amazed by the struggles and just the complexities of all our family's backgrounds. And I'm a little embarrassed, to be honest, and I said this to my parents. I had hours and hours of preparatory sessions with them, that we don't ask more questions or we don't pay more attention. And frankly, you know, assimilated Americans, we have this wonderful life here. And I think we forget and we take, we take for granted,
yes,
you know, what all of that meant and what that means for our lives today and our children's lives and their ability to, you know, as I, described really, their ability to, to learn and to worship and to be proud Jews. And so that was really what I took, greatly from the experience. And I think I'm going to reflect a lot on that, probably in the weeks to come.
Thank you. Frankie?
Yeah, Marvin, I remember your speech. I was totally touched by it because it was a similar story. And we are children of the Holocaust, and we must keep telling our story and letting everybody know about it. I think having come from a Holocaust family or a family that were refugees, we have always so appreciated America. At Thanksgiving, at Seder's, we say, thank God for America. It's still the best experiment that has ever been. And we are grateful that it was here to, accept us. And it also points out how important Israel is. That if, there wasn't Israel in 1940 to 45 when we needed it. And now it has to exist. I think it's just whatever way it exists, it's a very important place.
Absolutely.
In our religion and in our lives. Yeah.
Absolutely. I would echo all of those comments. Rabbi?
So I've got a couple of questions that have been emailed in, and just as a reminder for people who might have logged in late, you can email me questions for our speakers at rabbi.baisley@aemt.info, or you can put it in the comment section on the YouTube feed, which I'm monitoring right now. The question that I had, both of you have alluded to it, and Frankie a little bit less than allusion right now. How do you, when you look at what's happening in America around us, how has the fact that your families, both of you, have come from the Holocaust and have come from persecution, how has that affected how you see American society going on right now? Not necessarily as citizens of America, but as Jewish citizens of America.
Well, unfortunately, I can't be president because I wasn't born in this country. I could be Secretary of State, but I think we do appreciate the immigrant story. And over the last 50 years, we've seen how America has benefited from all the different people that have come from all different countries. And I think that we're at it's a difficult time in America because I think it's everybody has to feel comfortable here. And I don't think that's the case right now.
Yeah, I agree with you, Frankie. And I also think we have a responsibility. I think really that so much of, speaking obviously, against immigrants and separating people and, the treating of the other, right? That seems like there's a lot of, separating people and making people the other. I think that this is also a time where, especially as Jews, we really need to speak up and, share what, why this is wrong and connect all the stories of everyone's, past and present together, because it does make this, I still really have those ideals that we really are the best country on the planet because we give people all opportunity. But clearly there are many groups that are being held down now, and extreme, racism and just really deplorable things going on that as Jews, I really feel personally have a very strong responsibility to stand up and speak out.
Absolutely.
So here are two questions that I got online. The first is for Frankie. Actually, I think they're both for Frankie. Not only have you been involved in design and art as it appears at the temple, and as a shameless plug, usually Frankie, I guess I might be committing you right now, future, but some of your art or art donations can show up in the Purim raffle and auctions and stuff like that. And I know there are almost every Zoom call that I've been on with you at some point in the last couple of months, somebody said, oh, I've got one of your pieces over here behind me. Anyway, not only have you been involved in design and art as it appears at the temple, but I know that you are an artist. This is from Andrew Workman. Do you consider your art to be influenced by your Judaism? And if so, in what way?
I don't think, if you saw my work, I have three types of art that I do: landscape, abstract, and floral. So I'm not sure that there's a Jewish element to those, except it's creation and it's life. I could give them some titles that could sound inspired by Judaism, but I think Jewish people are talented. They are interested in the visual arts, in the creative arts, I think in Hollywood, you hear it in every way. And I think any art, and the visual arts is a way to express your feelings. And so it could be that you might have thought of a new idea for me to paint something with a Jewish theme, but so far I wouldn't say I have.
The next question from him is slightly different. You characterize your childhood and youth as secularly Jewish and light on Jewish education. It's not clear how strong your Jewish identity was when you entered college, and during your college years, you met, dated, and became engaged and married your husband. Your life since marriage seems to have had Jewish threads heavily woven into it as a result of marrying Mark, who has a strong Jewish identity. Is that true? And how much was his strong Jewish identity part of what caused your relationship to start and progress, I guess, your relationship to Judaism? How much of this was conscious free will on your part, and how much of it was bashert?
I think it's a combination of conscious and bashert. When I went to Simmons College, I found everybody was Jewish. I think it might have been 30%. They broke the quota at Simmons in 1963 when I went to college. And I gravitated to Jewish people. And my parents say it was just lucky that both their daughters married Jewish guys. It was never a requirement. They didn't, ever verbalize it. Mm-hmm. And I am glad I did. And meeting Mark and knowing he came from an Orthodox home, we still belong to Avisakim in Highland Park. We have a presence there. I think it's been bashert. That's the part that Mark brought it to our house. Mm-hmm. He said, when he needed to even learn more, when our girls were born, he wanted to be more knowledgeable. The way Rob, Sarah's husband, feels like it should be in your house. If you don't know it, why would you ask them to know it? So that's my answer.
I have another question that just came in, and if anybody wants to text me their questions, the more they're welcome to. I am not, however, going to divulge my cell phone number across the internet right now. But if you happen to have it, it's in the temple directory. You can text me a question. Here's another question for Frankie. Fred came and asks, why did your parents settle in the quote unquote wrong neighborhood in Columbus? And how was it for new immigrants in that neighborhood versus the Jewish side of town, or what it might have been like here today?
Well, I think my parents consciously chose to live in an assimilated, they wanted to assimilate in America. There were 2 other Jewish kids in my high school class out of 350. And so I really wasn't exposed with friendships in school while I was in Upper Arlington. But I did go to Hebrew school. Sunday school, sorry. I had friends there. My parents had a lot of Jewish friends. And I think it was just fortunate that I didn't really experience anti-Semitism when I was young in that setting. So I think they mimicked their assimilated secular life in Vienna. It was sort of the way they lived in England, and it was the way they chose to live here. And yeah.
Another question from Fred came in this time for Sarah. He points out, and I am no expert in this whatsoever, this is his question, that Khan is an unusual name for Polish Jews, is it not?
Yeah.
Was it changed? What was it originally?
Well, at once it was Cohen, right? Many moons ago, way more moons than anybody could probably count, but it was K8HN. And my father explained it, and I'm going to get the timing wrong, but far earlier than World War II, when maps changed and they were looking at translating government documents, the phonetic translation ended up being K-A-N and the H was dropped. So then it was Khan for multiple generations with K-A-N. And when my dad came to the States, he really thought about putting the H back in because clearly that's really the family name. But his parents were still alive and they kept it as K-A-N. So there we are. And yes, I get a lot of correspondence about Asian telephone service and things like that, because it's a very unusual Jewish name.
Sarah, growing up, did you know, you said that you spent a lot of time talking to your parents, I think you said, about some of the history and things that you were able to relate to us. Were you aware of as much of that growing up, or is that something you found out more about in doing some of the research, quote unquote, for your presentation today?
Yeah, I think I knew, I clearly knew a Clips Notes version, but my dad in retirement life spent a lot of time doing research and put together a history of his family and that, journey from Warsaw to France and their survival and hiding in France and hiding him. So that really actually helped uncover a lot of detail. And yeah, so a lot of this actually came from recent discovery. I had big notions, big timelines, but a lot of the details I did not know. My grandparents did reveal some stories, but they were also not completely open about everything that happened. And I think I probably will never honestly truly understand what life was like for anyone who returned home from wherever they survived. It's always something that I feel like I personally struggled with. And I feel like that might be my next chapter, to try to figure out, what was that like, that 45 or 47 time period over the next decade? And, how did all those Jews who survived, what happened to them?
Yeah, it had to be, think about it. They didn't have a home to go back to because what they had was no more. And, we struggle with the difficulties and the trials and tribulations of life as it is. But imagine that you were to have experienced something of that magnitude. What life? You need to create a whole new life. So it's a different world for them. Rabbi?
I don't have any other questions that have
Okay.
come in.
All
I'm
right.
just scanning everything.
Sarah, one other thought. Growing up, how do I want to ask this? Do you think anything would have been, would your perceptions of, sure they would have been different. How different do you think things would have been for you if you knew some of this when you were growing up as opposed to finding it out now? Would it have changed your attitude, you think, about some of the ways you grew up, some of the things that you did? The choice to leave religious school at 9 years old, that the Chabad not, I mean, I'm thinking more in a more general term that way.
If I had the knowledge or maybe maturity or non-obnoxious, entitled American kind of attitude toward things, I mean, you know, maybe, right? You know, maybe I would have made different choices. I think probably I would have honestly found an organized Jewish community earlier. Because my parents just didn't, you know, really have the ability to put that together outside of, shouldn't say what, because we did have an organized Jewish community. It was just this organized Jewish community of people who just didn't live near me necessarily. It was all these, you know, Polish Jewish emigres. So I had a lot of, but anyway, but I think I likely would have made other decisions to learn more and to be part of a more organized Jewish community. At an earlier age, probably than, you know, when I got pregnant, essentially.
It was really curiosity more on my part, because in some ways, Frankie, Mark's upbringing is not that dissimilar to mine, with the exception of the fact that my parents came here after the war. I grew up in a more conservadox type home. My parents were very involved in the temple. The temple was a critical part of our upbringing. So, you know, Hebrew school wasn't a question. It didn't exist as a question. You were doing that, that's it. I had the great honor of having my father as my Hebrew school teacher. That was always great, because that never sits well with the other kids, because you're the teacher's kid. I mean, that's just a bad combination. So that's why I was curious, Sarah, on some of the things that you were aware of, what you thought might have been different, et cetera. So that was my reason for asking the question.
So I have two more questions that just came in. The first is from Russ Einbinder, which is a question for both Sarah and Frankie. What lessons do you want future generations to get from your experience growing up and making it to this moment? Keeping in mind that we go live for Yisker Neela and for.
Okay, I would just say that you have to be grateful for freedom. If you're an immigrant, if your family was different, and then you have to have respect for everybody else who experienced the same. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I echo that. I also, you know, think just learning, you know, taking advantage of whatever learning. I mean, I don't know if it's this COVID time or whatever it is, I say to my kids pretty much every day, you know, I'm amazed how little I know, and I keep learning new things every day. And so I think the learning and to, you know, about our faith and about how we fit in the world. And I feel like I'm also, you know, challenging myself and challenging them in, you know, what else should we be doing? What else should we be thinking about? So I would say just the constant learning.
And here is the final question that I have from the outside world, unless suddenly somebody does a last minute question. This is from Evelyn Ehrenrich. Never mind, I just had another question come in. But Evelyn asks, what are your thoughts on the ways to keep stories like yours and more broadly the Holocaust among the younger generations? Because both of you have mentioned the Holocaust and stories and passing it on, and we're noticing that it's getting harder and harder to share those stories from immediate sources.
Evelyn, mazel tov on your new grandson. And I think you're going to want to tell your own story to your grandson. Everybody has a story, and the Holocaust is a pretty dramatic story, but I think everyone overcomes some difficult times. Families are made up of all different kinds of people, and I think I have come to realize I never had grandparents, and that is one of the most beautiful places to be in my life. And congratulations again, Evelyn. So I think Mark and I put together, we had letters that my grandparents had written to my aunt. She went to England first. So it's about 120 letters where my grandmother's talking about her daily life in Vienna and what it was like. And she heard that her daughter wrote that she met a man, an English Jewish man that she's going to marry, and how sad she is. She's not going to be at that wedding. So we have that as a document, and then we have given that to our kids. And it was a wonderful exercise for me to have my grandparents' voices alive. So I think what Sarah has written today is something I'm sure her kids should read, and hopefully someday your grandchildren will read.
Yeah, we just need to, I mean, I think we just need to, keep telling the stories. My dad in particular has done a lot of work with the Holocaust Museum and providing information. And I think, right, it's the general story of the Jews also, right? You have the history, and you have to keep repeating it and repeating it and repeating it. And right, and as Frankie said, obviously, it's certainly not, and we're not the only people who have been persecuted. I mean, I think all of these stories need to be repeated because, lest we forget.
Yes. And this question comes from Amy Warner, who's one of our officers, and is not at all leading a question whatsoever with this. But I guess in light of this changing world that we've just experienced over the last 7 months, she asks both of you, what is your wish or hope for the Anshe Emeth community for the future?
I hope we keep doing Zoom. I love having access to such a good variety. Our home has a place where we attend services, and I think we've also gotten to know each other in a way that we didn't in the past. And we said hello on the steps in between services it used to be early service and late service. And I think we have really come together as a community. And I just heard there's 700 people from all over the United States watching us. I think we're a global entity, and I hope we can keep offering the amazing programs and services that we do. I think we're doing great work. Thank you, Rabbi.
And I want us to be in the building, so selfishly. But as we think about the future, I think all of it, trying, it's a little bit of also trying to meet Jews where they are. So making sure that we can support all of the people who want to pray with us and learn with us and, sing with us and be part of our community. So I think that's all of our challenge. How do we keep it all going? But my hope is that we're able to, with the physical building, with technology, and thinking about, we talked about it, I think, pre-COVID, like how do we even, bring things to other places? Is it parks? Is it whatever it is? I hope that we can live in a world where we can bring all of that together.
To comment on something Frankie said with the number 700 is we were talking before we went live with this and looking just at StreamSpot and which is our temple website, and YouTube live. There were somewhere around 700 individual unique viewers, which means screens, not necessarily people watching a screen, for Kol Nidre services, not including Facebook. So this has really been a wonderful tool to getting out and reaching other people. You know, clearly we need to think, what does it mean to be a congregant? How do we identify people as congregants and bring people in? And I can tell you, Frankie, that we are not putting the Zoom out, trying to put Zoom back in the bottle of the genie when this is over. Marvin.
Yes.
Any last words?
Any last words? First of all, Rabbi, thank you again for giving me the privilege and the honor to be able to moderate this. Sarah and Frankie, thank you very much for sharing your stories with us. They're moving, they're insightful. They give us insight into who you are, things that we did not know. And that's one of the nice things about this is you find out something about a congregant that you thought you knew, but maybe you didn't really know that well. And thank you for giving us reason to stop and remember who Anshe Emeth is, because Anshe Emeth is a place where people from so many different facets have come together to find a home. And it's also a place where, as Rabbi, you alluded to in the beginning, with everything that's going on in the world, with the divisiveness that has become the norm, unfortunately, in so many ways, we have a reminder that we as Jews have an obligation to recognize there is no other. We're all one. We're all the same. We pray differently, but we care about each other. We care about our fellow man. We care about the people around us, and we care about the earth we all share. Rabbi, those are my closing comments. I will defer to you for anything further.
You know, that sounds like a sermon I might have given or will give at some point. So I again, I want to reiterate my thanks to the three of you. I'm looking forward to a time when we can all come together in one space for this. In terms of what's happening next, we're going to log off from this call and then go live for our Yisker Ne'ilah service. I know in the past people have asked in terms of timing and when things happen. I know some people feel very iffy about being at a Yisker service if their parents are still alive. However, with everything that's happened in the world, with the global pandemic, I feel like this Yisker is a Yisker that we all need to be a part of so that we can really have a sense of understanding and trying to find meaning in the loss that not just America, but the world has felt. But if you still feel very firmly about not being present for Yisker, I believe 5:05, 5:10 is when we're going to switch over to Ne'ilah. It's all going to be one service, so don't look for a new link, don't look for a new stream announcement or anything. It's all Yisker Ne'ilah is one service through. If you've got a child or a grandchild, at the very end, probably around 5:40, typically we have, you know, all the kids meet Sarah Levine in the Reitman Hall, and then she brings them onto the bima at 5:40, 5:45 to hear the shofar. No one's coming into the bima for this, but we're going to string together all of the Tekiah Gedolahs that all of the teams have done from Rosh Hashanah, the different Rosh Hashanah services, and string it into one gigantic Tekiah Gedolah for the end of services at around 5:40, 5:45. And if anybody out there wants to join us for Havdalah, bring a Havdalah set to the beginning of the service. And we're going to then turn into the melodies of Havdalah as we wish each other a Shana Tova. So Ne'ilah is going to be a beautiful and moving conclusion for our high holidays. So please join us at 4:30 or 5:05, depending on your minhag. And I look forward to seeing everybody there. And again, Shana Tova, Gemar Chatima Tova. I hope you're all having a meaningful fast, one that brings us to great actions of impact in our lives. So thank you.
Shana Tova. Frankie, Shana Tova.